The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 3, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 6, Side 2. Why did Gothic architecture decline? Partly because every style, like an emotion, exhausts itself by complete expression and invites reaction or change. The development of Gothic into perpendicular in England, flamboyant in France, left the form no future except exaggeration and decay. The collapse of the Crusades, the decline of religious belief, the diversion of funds from Mary to Mammon, from church to state, broke the spirit of the Gothic age. The taxation of the clergy after Louis IX depleted the cathedral treasuries. The communes and the guilds that had shared in the glory and the costs lost their independence, their wealth, and their pride. The Black Death and the 100 Years' War exhausted both France and England. Not only did new construction diminish in the 14th century, but most of the great cathedrals begun in the 12th and 13th were left unfinished. Finally, the rediscovery of classic civilization by the humanists and the revival of classical architecture in Italy, where it had never died, superseded Gothic with a new exuberance. From the 16th to the 19th century, Renaissance architecture dominated Western Europe, even through Baroque and Rococo. When, in its turn, the classic mood paled away, the Romantic movement of the early 19th century recreated the Middle Ages in idealizing imagination, and Gothic architecture returned. The struggle between the classic and the Gothic styles still rages in our churches and schools, our marts and capitals, while a new and indigenous architecture, bolder even than Gothic, rides the sky. Medieval man thought that truth had been revealed to him, so that he was spared from its wild pursuit. The reckless energy that we give to seeking it was turned in those days to the creation of beauty. And amid poverty, epidemics, famines, and wars, men found time and spirit to make beautiful 1,000 varieties of objects, from initials to cathedrals. Breathless before some medieval manuscript, humble before Notre Dame, feeling the far vision of Winchester's nave, we forget the superstition and squalor, the petty wars and monstrous crimes of the Age of Faith. We marvel again at the patience, taste, and devotion of our medieval ancestors, and we thank 1,000,000 forgotten men for redeeming the blood of history with the sacrament of art. Chapter 33, Medieval Music, 326 to 1300. 1. The Music of the Church. We have done the cathedral injustice. It was not the cold and empty tomb that the visitor enters today. It functioned. Its worshippers found in it not only a work of art, but the consoling, strengthening presence of Mary and her Son. It received the monks or canons who many times each day stood in the choir stalls and sang the canonical hours. It heard the importunate litanies of congregations seeking divine mercy and aid. Its nave and aisles guided the processions that carried before the people the image of the Virgin or the body and blood of their God. Its great spaces echoed solemnly with the music of the Mass. And the music was as vital as the church edifice itself, more deeply stirring than all the glory of glass or stone. Many a stoic soul, doubtful of the creed, was melted by the music, and fell on his knees before the mystery that no words could speak. The evolution of medieval music concurred remarkably with the development of architectural styles. As the early churches passed in the 7th century from the ancient domed or basilican forms to a simple masculine Romanesque, and in the 13th century to Gothic complexity, elevation, and ornament, so Christian music kept till Gregory I, from 540 to 604, the ancient monodic airs of Greece and the Near East, passed in the 7th century to Gregorian or plain chant, and flowered in the 13th century into polyphonic audacities rivaling the balanced strains of a Gothic cathedral. The barbarian invasions in the West and the resurgence of Orientalism in the Near East combined to break the tradition of Greek musical notation through letters placed above the words. But the 4 Greek modes, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, survived and begot by division the octoekos, or 8 manners of musical composition: contemplative, restrained; grave, solemn; cheerful, joyful; spirited, or ecstatic. The Greek language persisted for 3 centuries after Christ in the church music of the West, and still remains in the Kyrie eleison. Byzantine music took form under St. Basil. Mated Greek and Syrian chants reached its height in the hymns of Romanus, circa 495, and Sergius, circa 620, and made its greatest conquest in Russia. Some early Christians opposed the use of music in religion, but it soon appeared that a religion without music could not survive in competition with creeds that touched man's sensitivity to song. The priest learned to sing the Mass and inherited some of the melodies of the Hebrew cantor. Deacons and acolytes were taught to chant responses. Some were technically trained in a schola lectorum, which under Pope Celestine I, from 422 to 432, became a schola cantorum. Such trained singers formed great choirs. That of St. Sophia's had 25 cantors and 111 lectors, mostly boys. Congregational singing spread from east to west. The men alternated with the women in antiphonal song and joined with them in the Alleluia. The psalms they sang were thought to echo or imitate on earth the hymns of praise sung before God by the angels and saints in paradise. St. Ambrose, despite the apostolic counsel that women should be silent in church, introduced antiphonal singing to his diocese. "Psalms are sweet for every age and becoming to either sex," said this wise administrator. "They create a great bond of unity when all the people raise their voices in one choir." Augustine wept when he heard the Milan congregation singing Ambrose's hymns, and verified St. Basil's dictum that the listener who surrenders to the pleasure of music will be drawn to religious emotion and piety. The Ambrosian chant is still used in Milan churches today. A tradition universally accepted in the Middle Ages, and now, after long doubts, generally received, ascribes to Gregory the Great and his aides a reform and canonical determination of Roman Catholic music, resulting in the establishment of the Gregorian chant as the official music of the Church for 6 centuries. Hellenistic and Byzantine strains combined with Hebrew melodies of temple or synagogue to mold this Roman or plain chant. It was monodic, or one-song music. No matter how many voices participated, they all sang the same note. The women and boys often sang an octave higher than the men. It was simple music for voices of modest range. Now and then it allowed a more complex melisma, a melodious, wordless embellishment of a note or phrase. It was a free and continuous rhythm, not divided into regular meter or measures of time. Before the 11th century, the only musical notation used by the Gregorian chant consisted of small signs derived from the Greek accent marks and placed over the words to be sung. These neumes, meaning airs or breaths, indicated a rise or fall of tone, but not the degree of rise or fall, nor the duration of the note. Such matters had to be learned by oral transmission and the memorizing of an enormous body of liturgical song. No instrumental accompaniment was allowed. Despite these limitations, perhaps because of them, Gregorian chant became the most impressive feature of the Christian ritual. The modern ear, accustomed to complex harmony, finds these old chants monotonous and thin. They carry on a Greek, Syrian, Hebrew, Arab tradition of monody which only the Oriental ear can appreciate today. Even so, the chants sung in a Roman Catholic cathedral during Holy Week reached to the heart with a directness and weird power withheld from music whose complications divert the ear instead of moving the soul. Gregorian chant spread through Western Europe like another conversion to Christianity. Milan rejected it, as it likewise resisted papal authority, and southern Spain long preserved its Mozarabic chant, formed by Christians under Moslem rule and still used in a part of Toledo Cathedral. Charlemagne, who loved unity like a ruler, replaced the Gallican with the Gregorian chant in Gaul and established schools of Roman church music at Metz and Soissons. The Germans, however, with throats formed by climate and needs quite different from the Italian, had trouble with the more delicate strains of the chant. Said John the Deacon, "Their coarse voices, which roar like thunder, cannot execute soft modulations because their throats are hoarse with too much drinking." Perhaps the Germans deprecated the fioritura that from the 8th century forward embellished the Gregorian chant with tropes and sequences. The trope or turn began as a composition of words for a melisma, making this easier to remember. Later it became an interpolation of words and music into a Gregorian chant, as when the priest sang not Kyrie eleison, but Kyrie fons pietatis aquo bona cuncta procedunt eleison. The Church permitted such embellishments, but never accepted them into the official liturgy. Bored monks amused themselves by composing or singing such interpolations, until there were so many tropes that books known as tropers were published to teach or preserve the favored ones. The music of the ecclesiastical drama grew out of such tropes. Sequences were tropes designed to follow the Alleluia of the Mass. The custom had grown of prolonging the final vowel of this word in a long melody known as a jubilus, or chant of joy. In the 8th century, various texts were written for these inserted melodies. The composition of tropes and sequences became a highly developed art, and gradually changed Gregorian chant into an ornate form uncongenial to its original spirit and plain intent. This evolution ended the purity and dominance of Gregorian chant in that same 12th century which saw the transition from Romanesque to Gothic in the architecture of the West. The multiplication of complex compositions demanded for their transmission a better notation than that which plain chant had used. In the 10th century, Odo, abbot of Cluny, and Notcurbulus, a monk of St. Gall, resurrected the Greek device of naming notes by letters. In the 11th century, an anonymous writer described the use of the first 7 capitals of the Latin alphabet for the first octave of a scale, the corresponding lowercase Latin letters for the second octave, and Greek letters for the third. About 1040, Guido of Arezzo, a monk of Pomposa, near Ferrara, gave their present strange names to the first 6 notes of the scale by taking the first syllables of each half-line of a hymn to John the Baptist. Ut queant laxis resonare floris, mira gestorum famuli tuorum, solve polluti labii reatum. This psalmization, or naming of the musical notes by the syllables ut, or do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, became part of the inexorable heritage of Western youth. More vital was Guido's development of a musical staff. About 1000, the practice had arisen of using a red line to indicate the note now represented by F. Later a second line, yellow or green, was added to represent C. Guido, or someone shortly before him, extended these lines to make a staff of 4 lines, to which later teachers added a 5th. With this new staff and the ut, re, mi, wrote Guido, his choir boys could learn in a few days what formerly had taken them many weeks. It was a simple but epical advance, which earned for Guido the title of Inventor Musicae, and a splendid statue still to be seen in Arezzo's public square. The results were revolutionary. Singers were free from the task of memorizing the whole musical liturgy. Music could be more readily composed, transmitted, and preserved. The performer could now read music at sight and hear it with the eye, and the composer, no longer bound to keep close to traditional melodies lest singers refuse to memorize his work, could venture upon 1,000 experiments. Most important of all, he could now write polyphonic music, in which 2 or more voices could simultaneously sing or play different but harmonizing strains. We owe to our medieval forebears still another invention that made modern music possible. Tones could now be determined by dots placed on or between the lines of the staff, but these signs gave no hint as to how long a note was to be held. Some system for measuring and denoting the duration of each note was indispensable to the development of contrapuntal music, the simultaneous and harmonious procedure of 2 or more independent melodies. Perhaps some knowledge had seeped up from Spain of Arab treatises by Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and other Moslems who had dealt with measured music or mensural notation. At some time in the 11th century, Franco of Cologne, a priest-mathematician, wrote a treatise Ars Cantus Mensurabilis, in which he gathered up the suggestions of earlier theory and practice and laid down essentially our present system for indicating the duration of musical notes. A square-headed virga, or rod, formerly used as a neume, was chosen to represent a long note. Another neume, the punctum, or point, was enlarged into a lozenge to represent a short note. These signs were in time altered. Tails were added. By trial and error, through 100 absurdities, our simple mensural notation was evolved. These vital developments opened a wide door to polyphonic music. Such music had been written before Franco, but crudely. Toward the close of the 9th century, we find a musical practice called organizing, the singing of concords by concurring voices. Little is heard of it again till the end of the 10th century, when we find the names organum and symphonia applied to such compositions for 2 voices. The organum was a liturgical piece in which an old monodic strain was carried or held by the tenor, who was therefore so named, while another voice added a harmonizing melody. A variant of this form, the conductus, gave the tenor a new or popular tune and conducted another voice in a concurrent air. In the 11th century, the composers took a step as bold in its way as the Gothic balancing of thrusts. They wrote harmonies in which the conducted voice did not slavishly accompany the tenor in the rise or fall of the melody, but ventured upon other harmonies through notes not necessarily moving in a parallel line with the cantus firmus of the tenor. This declaration of independence became almost a rebellion when the second voice accompanied the ascending melody of the tenor with a descending movement. This harmony by contrast and fluent resolution of momentary discords became a passion with composers, almost a law. So, about 1100, John Cotton wrote, "If the main voice is ascending, the accompanying part shall descend." Finally, in the motet, apparently a diminutive from the French mot, a word or phrase, 3, 4, 5, even 6 different voices were made to sing in a complex weave of individual melodies whose diverse but concordant strains crossed and merged in a vertical-horizontal web of harmony as subtle and graceful as the converging arches of a Gothic vault. By the 13th century, this ars antiqua of polyphony had built the foundations of modern musical composition. In that exciting century, the enthusiasm for music rivaled the interest in architecture and philosophy. The Church looked askance upon polyphony. She distrusted the religious effect of music becoming a lure and end in itself. John of Salisbury, bishop and philosopher, called a halt to complexity of composition. Bishop Guillaume Durant branded the motet as disorganized music. Roger Bacon, a rebel in science, deplored the vanishing of the stately Gregorian chant. The Council of Lyons in 1274 denounced the new music, and Pope John XII in 1324 issued a papal condemnation of discantus, or polyphony, on the ground that the innovating composers chop up the melodies so that these rush around ceaselessly, intoxicating the ear without quieting it, and disturbing devotion instead of evoking it. But the revolution continued. In one citadel of the church, Notre Dame de Paris, the choirmaster Leoninus, about 1180, composed the finest organa of his time, and his successor, Perotinus, was guilty of compositions of 3 or 4 voices. Polyphony, like Gothic, spread from France to England and Spain. Giraldus Cambrensis, who lived possibly from 1146 to 1220, reported 2-part singing in Iceland, and said of his native Wales what one might say of it today. In their songs they do not utter the tunes uniformly, but manifoldly, in many manners and many notes, so that in a multitude of singers, such as it is the custom of this people to bring together, as many songs are to be heard as there are singers to be seen, and a various diversity of parts, finally coming together in one consonance and organic melody. In the end, the Church bowed to the infallibility of the zeitgeist, accepted polyphony, and made it a powerful servant of the faith, and prepared it for its Renaissance victories. 2. The music of the people. The impulse to rhythm expressed itself in 100 forms of secular music and dance. The Church had her reasons for fearing this instinct uncontrolled. It allied itself naturally with love, the great rival of religion as a source of song, and the hearty earthiness of the medieval mind, when the priest was out of sight, inclined it to a freedom, sometimes an obscenity, of text that shocked the clergy and provoked councils to vain decrees. The Galliards, or wandering scholars, found or composed music for their paeans to woman and wine, and their scandalous parodies of sacred ritual. Manuscripts circulated containing solemn music for the hilarious words of the Missa de Potatoribus, the Mass of the Topers, and the Officium Ribibaldorum, a prayer book for roisterers. Love songs were as popular as today. Some were tender as an nymph's orisons, some were seduction dialogues with delicate accompaniments. And of course there were war songs, calculated to forge unity through vocal unison, or to anesthetize the pursuit of glory with hypnotic rhythm. Some music was folk song, composed by anonymous genius and appropriated, perhaps transformed, by the people. Other popular music was the product of professional skill using all the arts of polyphony learned in the liturgy of the Church. In England, a favorite and complex form was the roundel, in which one voice began a melody, a second began the same or a harmonizing melody when the first had reached an agreed point, A third chimed in after the second was on its way, and so on, until as many as 6 voices might be running the rounds in a lively contrapuntal fugue. Almost the oldest roundel known is the famous Summer Is A-Comin' In, probably composed by a Reading monk about 1240. Its 6-part complexity shows polyphony already at home among the people. The words still live with the spirit of a century in which all medieval civilization was coming to flower. Summer is a-comin' in, loudly sing cuckoo. Groweth seed and bloweth mead, and blossoms the woodland now. Sing cuckoo. Ewe bleateth after lamb, loweth after calf the cow. Bullock leapeth, buck turns off, merry sing cuckoo. Cuckoo, cuckoo, well singest thou, cuckoo. Seest thou not? Never now. Sing cuckoo now, sing cuckoo, sing cuckoo, sing cuckoo now. Such a song must have been congenial to the minstrels or jongleurs who wandered from town to town, from court to court, even from land to land. We hear of minstrels from Constantinople singing in France, of English gleemen singing in Spain. A performance by minstrels was a usual part of any formal festivity. So Edward I of England engaged 426 singers for the wedding of his daughter Margaret. Such minstrel groups often sang part songs, sometimes of bizarre complexity. Usually the songs were composed, words and music, by troubadours in France, trovatori in Italy, minnesingers in Germany. Most medieval poetry before the 13th century was written to be sung. A poem without music, said the troubadour Fouquet, is a mill without water. Of 2,600 troubadour songs extant, we have the music of 264, usually in the form of neumes and ligatures on a 4 or 5-line staff. The bards of Ireland and Wales probably played instruments and sang. In the manuscripts that preserve the cantigas, or canticles, collected by Alfonso X of Castile, several illustrations show musicians in Arab dress performing on Arab instruments. The pattern of many of the songs is Arabic. Possibly the music, as well as the early themes and poetic forms of the troubadours, was derived from Moorish songs and melodies passing through Christian Spain into southern France. Returning crusaders may have brought Arabic musical forms from the East. It is to be noted that the troubadours appear about 1100, contemporary with the First Crusade. Startling is the variety of medieval musical instruments. Percussion instruments, bells, cymbals, timbrels, the triangle, the bombulum, the drum. String instruments, lyre, cithara, harp, psaltery, noble, organistrum, lute, guitar, vielle, viola, monochord, gigue. Wind instruments, pipe, flute, hautboy, bagpipe, clarion, flageolet, trumpet, horn, organ. These are a selection out of hundreds. Everything was there for hand or finger, foot or bow. Some of them had survived from Greece, some had come, in form and name, from Islam, like the rebec, lute, and guitar. Many were precious examples of medieval artistry in metal, ivory, or wood. The usual instrument of the minstrel was the vielle, a short violin played with an archer's curved-back bow. Before the 8th century, most organs were hydraulic, but Jerome in the 4th century described a pneumatic organ. And Bede, 673 to 735, wrote of organs with brass pipes filled with air from bellows and uttering a grand and most sweet melody. St. Dunstan, who lived circa 925 to 988, was accused of sorcery when he built an Aeolian harp that played when placed against a crack in the wall. In Winchester Cathedral, about 950, an organ was installed having 26 bellows, 42 bellows blowers, and 400 pipes. The keys were so gargantuan that the organist had to strike them with fists, protected by thickly padded gloves. Milan had an organ whose pipes were of silver. Venice had one with pipes of gold. All notion of medieval hell-stricken gloom vanishes before a collection of medieval musical instruments. What remains is again the picture of a people at least as happy as ourselves, full of the bounce and lust of life, and no more oppressed with fear of the end of the world than we with doubts whether civilization will be destroyed before we can complete its history. Chapter 34. The Transmission of Knowledge, 1000 to 1300. 1. The Rise of the Vernaculars. As the Church had preserved in some measure that political unity of Western Europe that the Roman Empire had achieved, So her ritual, her sermons, and her schools remained a Roman heritage now lost, an international language intelligible to all the literate population of Italy, Spain, France, England, Scandinavia, the Lowlands, Germany, Poland, Hungary, and the Western Balkans. Educated men in these countries used Latin for correspondence, business records, diplomacy, law, government, science, philosophy, and nearly all literature before the 13th century. They spoke Latin as a living language, which almost daily developed a new word or phrase to denote the new or changing realities or ideas of their lives. They wrote their love letters in Latin, from the simplest billet doux to the classic epistles of Héloïse and Abélard. A book was written not for a nation, but for the continent. It needed no translation, and passed from country to country with a speed and freedom unknown today. Students went from one university to another with no thought of linguistic embarrassments. Scholars could lecture in the same language at Bologna, Salamanca, Paris, Oxford, Uppsala, and Cologne. They did not hesitate to import new words into Latin, sometimes to the horror of the Petrarchan Ciceronian ear. So Magna Carta ruled that no freeman should be disaesiatus or imprisonatus. Such words make us wince, but they kept Latin alive. Many modern English terms, for instance, instance, substantive, essence, entity, descended from medieval additions to the Latin tongue. Nevertheless, the disruption of international intercourse by the collapse of Rome, the introverting poverty of the Dark Ages, the decay of roads and the decline of commerce, developed in speech those variations which segregation soon expands. Even in its heyday, Latin had suffered national modifications from diversities of climate and oral physiology. In its very homeland, the old language had been changed. The abdication of literature had left the field to the vocabulary and sentence structure of the common man, which had always been different from those of the poets and orators. The influx of Germans, Gauls, Greeks, and Asiatics into Italy brought a multiformity of pronunciation, and the natural laziness of tongue and mind sloughed off the precise inflections and terminations of careful speech. H became silent in late Latin. V, classically pronounced like the English W, acquired the sound of the English V. N before S dropped away. Mensa, or table, was pronounced mesa. The diphthongs AE and OE, classically pronounced like the English I and OI, were now like Long English A or French E. As final consonants were slurred and forgotten, changing portus to porto or port, rex to re or bois, and coelum to cielo or ciel, case endings had to be replaced by prepositions, conjugational endings by auxiliary verbs. The old demonstrative pronouns ile and illa became definite articles, il, el, lo, le, la, and the Latin unus, or one, was shortened to form the indefinite article un, or un. As declensions disappeared, it sometimes became difficult to tell whether a noun was the subject before or the object after the predicate. Viewing this continuous process of change over 20 centuries, we may think of Latin as the still living and literary language of Italy, France, and Spain, no more transformed from the speech of Cicero than his from that of Romulus or ours from Chaucer's. Spain had begun to speak Latin as early as 200 B.C. By Cicero's time, its dialect had diverged so far from the usage of Rome that Cicero was shocked by what seemed to him the barbarisms of Corduba. Contact with Iberian dialects softened the Latin consonants in Spain. T into D, P into B, K into G, totum into todo, operam into obra, ecclesia into iglesia. French also softened the Latin consonants, and while often keeping them in writing, frequently dropped them in speech. Tout, meaning all, œuvre, meaning work, église, meaning church, and est, meaning is. The oath taken at Strasbourg in 842 by Louis the German and Charles the Bald was sworn in two languages, German and French, a French still so Latin that it was called lingua romana. Not till the 10th century was it sufficiently distinct to receive the name lingua gallica. The lingua romana in turn divided into what France called two languages, the Languedoc of France south of the Loire and the Languedoc of northern France. It was a medieval custom to differentiate dialects by their way of saying yes. South France said it with oc from the Latin hoc, meaning this. The north used oui, a fusion of the Latin hoc ille, this that. Southeastern France had a dialect of the Languedoc called Provençal. It became a polished literary language in the hands of the troubadours and was almost snuffed out by the Albigensian Crusades. Italy formed her vernacular more slowly than Spain or France. Latin was her native speech. The clergy, who spoke Latin, were especially numerous in Italy, and the continuity of her culture and her schools kept the language from changing so freely as in lands with broken traditions. As late as 1230, St. Anthony of Padua preached to the common people in Latin. However, a Latin sermon delivered at Padua in 1189 by a visiting prelate had to be translated by the local bishop into the popular tongue. Italian hardly existed as a language at the beginning of the 13th century. There were merely some 14 dialects continued and variously corrupted from the ancient Latin of the marketplace, each barely intelligible to the rest, and cherishing its differences with passionate atomism. Sometimes different quarters of the same city, as at Bologna, had distinct dialects. The predecessors of Dante had to create a language as well as a literature. The poet, in a pleasant fancy, thought that the Tuscan troubadours chose Italian as their medium because they wrote of love, and the ladies they addressed might not understand Latin. Even so, about 1300, he hesitated between Latin and the Tuscan dialect as the language of the Divine Comedy. By the narrow margin of this choice, he escaped oblivion. While Latin was dividing reproductively into the Romance languages, Old German was splitting into Middle German, Frisian, Dutch, Flemish, English, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, and Icelandic. Old German is merely a convenient phrase to cover the many dialects that exercised their tribal or provincial sovereignty in Germany before 1050. Flemish, Dutch, Westphalian, Eastphalian, Alemannic, Bavarian, Franconian, Thuringian, Saxon, Silesian. Old German passed into Middle German from 1050 to 1500, partly through the influx of new words with the coming of Christianity. Monks from Ireland, England, France, and Italy labored to invent terms to translate Latin. Sometimes they appropriated Latin words bodily into German: Kaiser, Prince, Legende. This was legitimate thievery. Tragic, however, was the influence of Latin sentence structure, keeping the verb to the end, in changing the once simple syntax of the German people into the stiff, inverted, and breathtaking periods of the later German style. Perhaps the finest German was the Middle High German, written by the great poets of the 13th century: Walter von der Vogelweide, Hartmann von Auer, Gottfried of Strasbourg, Wolfram von Eschenbach. Never again, except in Heine and the young Goethe, was German so simple, flexible, direct, clear. The Teutonic speech of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes went with them to England in the 5th century and laid the foundations of the English language, gave it almost all its short and racy words. French flooded the land with the Normans and ruled the court, the courts, and the aristocracy from 1066 to 1362, while Latin continued to preside over religion and education, and, till 1731, remained de rigueur in official documents. Thousands of French words entered into English, above all in costume, cookery, and law. Half the terminology of English law is French. For 3 centuries, the literatures of France and England were one, and as late as Chaucer, who lived from 1340 to 1400, the spirit and language of English letters were half French. After the loss of her French possessions, England was thrown back upon herself, and the Anglo-Saxon elements in English speech triumphed. When the French domination passed, the English language had been immeasurably enriched. By adding French and Latin to its German base, English could triply express any one of 1,000 ideas: kingly, or royal, or regal, twofold, or double, or duplex, daily, or journal, or diurnal. To this it owes its wealth of discriminating synonyms and verbal nuances. He who should know the history of words would know all history. 2. The world of books. How were these diverse languages written? After the fall of Rome in 476, the conquering barbarians adopted the Latin alphabet and wrote it with a cursive or running hand that bound the letters together and gave most of them a curved form instead of the straight lines that had been found convenient in writing upon hard surfaces like stone or wood. The Church preferred in those centuries a majuscule, or large letter writing, to facilitate the reading of missals and books of hours. When the copyists of Charlemagne's time preserved Latin literature by making many copies of the classics, they saved costly parchment by adding a minuscule, or small letter writing. They agreed on set forms for the letters and created the set minuscule lettering that became for 4 centuries the usual medium of medieval books. In the 12th century, as if in accord with the exuberant decoration then developing in Gothic architecture, the letters acquired flourishes, hairlines, and hooks, and became the Gothic lettering that prevailed in Europe till the Renaissance, and in Germany till our time. Very few medieval manuscripts were punctuated. This breath-guiding device, known to the Hellenistic Greeks, had been lost in the barbarian upheaval. It reappeared in the 13th century, but was not generally adopted till printing established it in the 15th century. Printing was in some measure prepared as early as 1147 by the use of woodcuts in Rhenish monasteries for printing initial letters or patterns upon textiles. Divers forms of shorthand were practiced, much inferior to the Tyronian notes developed by Cicero's slave. Writing was upon parchment, papyrus, vellum, or paper, with quill or reed pens using black or colored inks. Papyrus disappeared from common use in Europe after the Islamic conquest of Egypt. Vellum, prepared from the skin of young lambs, was expensive and was reserved for luxurious manuscripts. Parchment, made from coarse sheepskin, was the usual medium of medieval writing. Till the 12th century, paper was a costly import from Islam, but in 1190 paper mills were set up in Germany and France, and in the 13th century Europe began to make paper from linen. Many parchments were scraped to erase old manuscript and receive a second composition, or palimpsest. Old works were lost by such erasures, by misplacement of manuscripts, by war and pillage, by fire or decay. Huns sacked monastic libraries in Bavaria, Northmen in France, Saracens in Italy. Many Greek classics perished in the plunder of Constantinople in 1204. The Church had at first discountenanced the reading of the pagan classics. In nearly every century some fearful voice, Gregory I, Isidore of Seville, Peter Damian, was raised against them. Theophilus, Archbishop of Alexandria, destroyed all pagan manuscripts that he could find, and Greek priests, according to Demetrius Chalcondylus, persuaded Greek emperors to burn the works of the Greek erotic poets, including Sappho and Anacreon. But in those same centuries there were many ecclesiastics who cherished a fondness for the old pagans and saw to it that their works were preserved. In some cases, to disarm censure, they read the most Christian sentiments into pagan poetry, and by genial allegory turned even Ovid's amatory art into moral verse. An abundant heritage of classical literature was preserved by monastic copyists. Tired monks were told that God would forgive one of their sins for every line they copied. Ordericus Vitalis informs us that one monk escaped hell by the margin of a single letter. Second only to the monks as copyists were private or professional scribes, who were engaged by rich men or by booksellers or by monasteries. Their labor was wearisome, and evoked from them strange requests on the final page. Explicit hoc totem, pro Christo da mihi potum. This completes the whole. For Christ's sake, give me a drink. Another scribe thought he deserved more, and wrote as his colophon, Dator pro penna scriptori pulchra puella. For the work of the pen let the writer receive a beautiful girl. The medieval church exercised no regular censorship over the publication of books. If a book proved both heretical and influential, like Abelard's on the Trinity, it would be denounced by a church council. But books were then too few to be a prime peril to orthodoxy. Even the Bible was rare outside of monasteries. A year was required to copy it, a year's income of a parish priest to buy it. Few clergymen had a full copy. The New Testament, and especially books of the Old, had a wider circulation. Bibles of great size, magnificently decorated, were produced in the 12th century. They could be handled only on a reading desk, usually in a monastic library, and might be chained to the desk for better preservation. The church took fright when she found that the Waldensians and Albigensians were making and disseminating their own translations of scriptural books, and a church council at Narbonne in 1227, as we have seen, forbade laymen to possess any portion of the Scriptures. But in general, before the 14th century, the Church was not opposed to Bible reading on the part of the laity. She did not encourage it, for she distrusted popular interpretations of the scriptural mysteries. The size of a book and its pages was determined by the size of the available skins, each of which was folded to make a folio. After the 5th century, books were no longer issued in rolls, as in antiquity. The skins were cut in rectangular sizes to make 4, or quarto, 8, or octavo, 12, duodecimo, or 16, sextodecimo, sheets to a folio. Some sextodecimos, written in a fine Italian hand, crowded long works into small compass to fit into the pocket or be a convenient manual. The binding might be of heavy parchment, cloth, leather, or board. Leather covers might be decorated by blind tooling, that is, stamping uncolored designs into them with hot metal dyes. Moslem artists settled in Venice introduced into Europe the technique of filling in such depressed parts with gold tints. Wood covers might be decorated with enamel or carved ivory, or inlaid with gold, silver, or gems. St. Jerome rebuked the Romans, "Your books are carved with precious stones, and Christ died naked." Few modern volumes rival the sumptuous bindings of medieval books. Even simple books were a luxury. An ordinary volume cost between $160 and $200 in the currency of the United States of America in 1949. Bernard of Chartres, a leader in the 12th century revival of the ancient classics, left a library of only 24 volumes. Italy was richer than France, and its famous jurist, the elder Accursius, collected 63 books. We hear of a great Bible being sold for 10 talents, at least $10,000, of a missal exchanged for a vineyard, of 2 volumes of Priscian, the 5th century grammarian being paid for with a house and lot. The cost of books delayed the rise of a bookseller's trade till the 12th century. Then the university towns engaged men as stationarii and librarii to organize corps of copyists to transcribe books for teachers and students. And these men sold copies to all who cared to pay. They seem never to have dreamed of paying a live author. If a man insisted on writing a new book, he had to pay its costs, or find a king or lord or magnate to grace his palm for a dedication or a laud. He could not advertise his book except by word of mouth. He could not publish it, make it public, except by getting it used in a school or having it recited before whatever audience he could collect. So Gerald of Wales, on returning from Ireland in 1200, read his topography of that country before an assemblage at Oxford. The cost of books and the dearth of funds for schools produced a degree of illiteracy which would have seemed shameful to ancient Greece or Rome. This book is continued on Cassette 7, Side 1.